document is written
in the Samoa Agreement.
The Samoa Agreement.
The Samoa Agreement.
I believe that all of us here today for the Samoa Agreement signing ceremony are saying, Hyman. We have now reached the final destination. All the negotiations that was launched in 2018 for a renewed partnership agreement to replace the Cotonou Agreement.
Today I wanted to talk with you concerning the Samoa Agreement. I recognize that there are things in the agreement that people may not have appreciated, they don't understand, and that there were some concerns, very real and genuine concerns that were raised about what have we committed ourselves to. And as the minister who had responsibility for the agreement, I thought it only fitting that I should share with you concerning the things that are of concern. The Samoa Agreement is an agreement between 106 countries belonging to the EU, to Africa, to the Caribbean, and the Pacific. And they come together and form an agreement that governs how they relate to each other and cooperate with each other to create value and benefit, sustainable development. Just to give you a little background, we would have started our relationship with the EU in agreements, starting with our Lome Agreement, which would have allowed us to sell our sugar and banana. But we lost that when we had the Cotonou Agreement. The Cotonou Agreement then shifted to trade and development mostly. And in between there, the European Union and the CARIFORM countries agreed that what they would do is have a specific dedicated trade agreement that would be more detailed, and that is the Economic Partnership Agreement that you would hear so much about. Having done that, it meant that when we needed to create the Samoa Agreement to succeed the Cotonou, it meant it would not have as much detail on things like trade, because that is already accommodated within the European EPA, the Economic Partnership Agreement. And so in the Samoa Agreement, what you have is the shift now to a partnership. In the Cotonou, quite a bit of that funding would have been grant funding. Some of it would have been loans, but mostly they were helping us to be able to build up our countries that they could pursue sustainable development. Under the Samoa, the shift now is more to partnership, where they're saying there's accountability and there's a need for everybody to put something on the table. This is one of the major changes in the Samoa Agreement. With regards to trade and development then, what they were working on was the concept that, yes, we have a trade agreement, but in the Samoa Agreement, there are some specific areas that we want to focus in on that we will especially give support to. And these are outlined throughout the Samoa Agreement. So you will see a wide universe of concerns, whether you're talking about maritime, whether you're talking about industrial development, whether you're talking about small arms trafficking, whether you're speaking about drugs, if you're speaking about taxation. There are a whole host of areas that the Samoa Agreement seeks to cover and to establish an agreement between countries as to how we will treat to these matters and how we will cooperate with each other in moving these matters forward. In relation then to trade specifically, what they did was to select out 3 areas that they thought were of primary concern. And these are 3 areas that both the OACP, which would be the African, Caribbean, and Pacific states, along with the EU, believe are the major ones that are of importance to them. And those cover things like climate resilience. Why is this important? Because the developing world forms about 80% of the world. And if they cannot make the transition to renewable energy, to climate resilient building, adaptation, mitigation, it means that all of the efforts that we would be making in other parts of the world would come to naught and would not halt the fast decline of our climate change situation. Therefore, climate resilience was one that was important. The second one was digital transformation, that if countries are left behind in terms of their access to digital technology and the effective use of it for efficiency and for commerce, it means that you will get left behind in the economic race. Therefore, that was also important, both to the Europeans and to us. The Europeans, of course, have an interest in it because those who are able to position themselves within the digital world will be able to command a level of economic benefit that will start to count money, not in trillions, but in quadrillions. So it was important to everybody at the table. And the other area was private sector development. Part of the challenge that we have in the EPA is that because private sector development is weaker in the OACP countries, we've not been able to take as much advantage as we should have of the opportunities that were there. And because the Europeans have to account to their citizens for how their money is spent, is it producing the result? People are going to ask, well, what are the trade results that you have created? And therefore it was important to strengthen private sector development so that more energy could happen within the trading realm. And that is the thing that is of critical importance to us as well, because we can't go forward globally unless we have private sector development. So in the agreement, we're talking about partnership, we're talking about equal responsibility. And this is where the European Investment Bank now becomes important. You'll see it featured more in the Samoa Agreement than you see it in other agreements. Why? Because across the world, there is a major economic transformation taking place. And countries are hustling to be able to position themselves within the opportunities that might exist in Africa, in Latin America, and also in the area of seabed mining. There are all kinds of things that are going to emerge now as new frontiers for economic development. And so countries want to be able to position to do that. The European Investment Bank allows the Europeans to have the opportunity to invest in some of those major projects that will take place across the world. And therefore, this is why there's a prominence of the EIB and an insistence that instead of grant funding, that we start to look at loans, reasonable rates that we can engage in with the EIB. Now, this partnership then also has at its center the issue of principles and what do we stand for. Because the Europeans have to balance the fact that if they are investing, if they're helping countries, their citizens will ask, but how could you be supporting such and such a country that has such a horrible record on human rights, that is trafficking in human beings, that is creating war across the world? These are the things that citizens ask. And as we are accountable to our citizens, they're accountable to theirs too. And this is why the agreement will reflect things of that nature, because they need to ensure that basic human rights are being observed by the people that they partner with.
I believe that those of us who had a security pass to come into this building ought to recognize that we are not just here as representatives of our country, but we are here in trust for humanity.
Now, I don't have enough time to dialogue with you about the foreign policy that is running behind all of this. And when we get the opportunity in Parliament to share on this Samoa Agreement, we will share with you what are the foreign policy considerations that drive what we are doing and what drives what the Europeans are doing. But suffice it to say, because of the dynamics in the foreign policy arena, the EIB is not here to be used as a stick, rather is here to be used as a carrot, because they want to be able to get investments in many parts of the world. And what does the CARICOM grouping want? We need to attract investment that will give us the jobs for our young people, that will give us the opportunity to earn foreign exchange, and to give government the type of revenues that we can continue to provide the services which citizens need, whether you're talking about healthcare or schools or roads, whatever it is. we need to be able to earn, and therefore the investment is mutually beneficial to us all. I know that there's a view out there that people can come and force on another grouping that may have less power their views and insist on you doing things that you do not wish to do. Let me state first of all that when Barbados goes into a discussion to develop an agreement, we do not go with the view that someone is here to teach us how to do our business. Rather, we have settled what are the governmental goals, what are our objectives, and what we go to do is to seek partners who can work collaboratively with us to help us achieve that. And the basis of the negotiations is for us to be able to achieve our very best efforts in that regard. And so negotiators are tasked with an understanding of what it is we want, what it is we will accept, and what it is we will refuse. So the principles of negotiation have been written down in the same Samoa agreement. You have in Article 2, for example, that the idea here is to develop the type of friendly relations based on respect for the principle of sovereign equality, refrain from threat or use of force to affect the territorial integrity or political independence of any country. That's one of the main principles, that force is not what is to be used in regard to this agreement. There's also the notion that we must have a multi-stakeholder approach. In other words, as you seek to advance any of the ideas that you have agreed to in this particular agreement, you must ensure that all of the stakeholders in your country have been engaged, it has been explained to them, and they are given a voice and are able to make an input so that you know what is the distance that the nation is prepared to go on any particular area, that this is important, that this is not something that you come and you force on your citizens. So in Article 3, it speaks about the different types of actors: parliaments, local authorities, civil society, the private sector. Make sure they're duly informed and that they are consulted so that they are agreed priorities and shared agendas. Now, what happens if something we are discussing may suit one group but is disadvantageous to the other group? Article 4.2 tells us that there may be synergies between policies, but we need to ensure that we avoid or minimize negative impacts of these same policies on others. In other words, if it is going to have a negative impact on the other side, then the policy has to be adjusted until both parties can be comfortable with what is agreed. What is done in one country cannot affect the national sovereignty of that particular country. We must ensure that our interests are addressed, that they're met, or we're not seriously disadvantaged. And what does that mean? That negotiators have a responsibility to make sure our interests are addressed, that they're met. If they can't be met, make sure that you don't agree to anything that disadvantages your people. And to arrive at that, what is allowed in international agreements when there are different perspectives is the use of best effort, best endeavor language. So if we cannot agree on the specifics of how a pencil should be made, we can't agree on this, and everybody has to make some kind of writing implement, then instead of specifying the specifics of a pencil, you use best endeavor language where you speak about promote, support, encourage, coordinate, strengthen. This is the language that you use so that each country can then interpret that to suit their own national circumstances. And as you can appreciate, if 106 countries have 106 different interpretations of any matter, there's no way to accommodate it in an agreement. And that's one of the reasons why best endeavor language is used. And if you look right through the agreement, you will see the areas where they were not able to come up with the specifics, and therefore they opted for best endeavor language to be able to include everyone. A good example of when countries do not agree on something, how it will actually be treated, is found in Article 9. Now, Article 9 deals with the death penalty. We all know that that is a hot topic. There are countries who go for it, and there are some who do not want it to be a part of their law. So how do you deal with it? In the Samoa Agreement at Article 9, it says that where countries have on their laws the death penalty, let us agree then that you ensure that there's due process. In other words, that you know that for sure this person has done something worthy of the death penalty. And let us agree the minimum standards, meaning that how you implement it minimizes unnecessary suffering. This is an example of accommodating the differences in perspectives and what nations are prepared to do, so that you can see from this that there is not that intention of forcing on another country things that it cannot accept and its citizens will not accept. So let us deal with some of the issues that came up as a major concern for us here. There has been concern about the use of the word gender. What does it mean? There's the concern that there may be hidden references to LBGT issues. The Samoa Agreement does not deal with that matter. The Samoa Agreement at Article 10 speaks to gender equality, and it explains what it means by gender equality. In Article 10.1, it says there must be gender equality where women are going to be able to have the same rights as men. And so what it says in 10.2, it goes to explain that. It acknowledges that gender inequality deprives women of their basic human rights. It denies them the right to do things that men are allowed to do. At 10.3, it says, it outlines specifically that gender equality seeks to cover things like women being able to be free from harassment, from abuse, from being trafficked, that they have control over economic property, that they are able to get involved in political activity, that they have access to education, that they have access to health care. Because the concern is that across the world, even now today, there are millions of women who do not enjoy the same access that we have as Barbadian women. And we still have a little way to go. However, it is important for us to recognize that one of the things the world agreed to at the Beijing conference was the importance of women's freedoms, so that the entire population could have access to the very best of life.
Women's movements and NGOs asked for and governments adopted a visionary agenda for gender equality. The Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action called for systemic change to realize the rights of women and girls around the world. It was a promise by the nations of the world to end gender-based violence, secure girls' rights, ensure equal pay for work of equal value, increase women's participation in decision-making, and end women's poverty.
Now, again, back in Article 29, there was concern over the references under health when it speaks about universal access to sexual and reproductive health rights, etc., access to family planning, information, education, reproductive health, etc. And here you see the best endeavor language is used because each country will interpret that differently. It speaks about strengthen, promote, reaffirm commitment to, cooperate, support universal access to sexual and reproductive health. And that means what is available to the country where you are at. Every country does not offer every kind of service for sexual and reproductive health. Some cannot afford it, and some don't believe in some aspects of it. But what they're asking, use your best effort to strengthen, promote, reaffirm, cooperate, support, to ensure that whatever is the best that can happen does occur. Article 36 references gender equality and women's rights and girls' empowerment. And the language that is used here in Article 36 is to ensure that you empower the women in your country to be able to have their best life. So there is no reference here to gender changes, because that is not part of this particular conversation. And you can't, after the fact, change its meaning. It has to have the meaning that was intended at the time when something is negotiated. People express concern about the review process, that if there's a review at Beijing, what does that mean? Suppose they put in something that we don't like, but how would a review be done? There are two levels to a review. One, there may be things that we did not think of at Beijing that were not covered. So for example, suppose we discovered that cell phones are totally harmful to women's reproductive health. We discovered that there's a problem with that. There was no provision for that. So what you would do is, when you do a review, you would say, well, look, we've discovered that this thing is also injurious to women. We need to add it to what we've agreed to. And again, the countries have to agree to that addition. If you want to change now your definition of what is a woman, you now have to come back as countries and to be able to vote on that. Someone cannot go in a corner and sit down and make new definitions that then bind everybody who would have signed on to the Beijing Accord. So there's no need to have a fear about that. Each step of the way, countries have to vote and negotiate. I also want to share with you concerning the issue of comprehensive sexual education. Again, it's an area that every country will have differences in what they would want to include. So it would not be feasible to sit down and spell this out, because we're not there for anyone to dictate to us what we are to do. So again, you have the best endeavor efforts in relation to comprehensive sexual education. If you check the UN speaks about the absolute importance of helping boys and girls, men and women, to understand not only the physical aspects, but the social aspects, the sexual aspects, the emotional aspects, all aspects pertaining to your sexual life. And they explain that this is important, that people can make informed and safe choices, but they can't do that if they don't have the necessary information. Now, in Barbados, we do not have sexual education in our schools. That is a conversation that the Ministry of Education will have with the country as to what would be included in sexual education. But do we need it? Yes. I'll explain why. In Barbados, we have a situation where you have children in a home who may find themselves the object of sexual abuse by someone in the home. Sometimes it's a family member. Sometimes it may be someone visiting that home. And the child may not know how to cope with it. A mother may not know how to cope with finding out that someone is abusing their child. And so the issue of sexual education for everyone really is very important, so that we create safe homes and safe communities for our children to be in. 1 in 3 girls in Barbados are sexually abused before they reach the age of consent. That is of great concern. I've heard stories of how there are people who patrol near schools, secondary schools, and entice young girls to get in the car and go and perform sexual acts in exchange for money, for jewelry, for food, for whatever. And so if we don't help that young girl to understand that engaging in that behavior is extremely risky, if we do not help her to understand how to make decisions that are respectful of her body, respectful of her person, and to be able to make decisions that will help her life to be a good life, then we would have failed her. But what we need to do is to discuss what do we mean by comprehensive sexual education and agree as to how we will implement it in the country. And that is important to be able to minimize the abuse that we're seeing across Barbados and other parts of the world. You will notice that the Samoa Agreement has two parts. You have the general provisions, which we are all obligated to support, and then you have what is known as the regional protocols. The regional protocols are customized for each area depending on what are the needs for that area. Article 2.3 says that when we agree to implement the regional protocol, it must be done in accordance with the broad principles of the general part, while taking into account the specificities of each region and to tailor the actions to the different needs in that region, so that in the regional protocol you will see how the things in the general protocol really roll out for Barbados. And that is what we have agreed to in order to provide Barbados with an opportunity to be part of a collective that will collaborate to be able to bring transformation to a number of things. And what we will do as we go further and explain more to you what are some of the wider provisions that are truly helpful to Barbados. Just to name a few, there's going to be assistance in terms of maritime matters. We don't have the resources to be able to exploit our maritime space, but Barbados is a maritime state. We have over 400 square miles of maritime state. Now, how do we take that and use that beneficially for the country? You're going to need access to technology, you're going to need access to guidance, etc. to be able to do that. You're going to need investment to do it. And this particular agreement allows us to do things like that. You're going to have problems with small arms trafficking. We have a problem here where a number of guns are on the street, and they were causing quite a challenge to us recently. Things have quietened down now. But if we need help with small arms trafficking, this agreement says, look, you can pull on resources, you can pull on technical assistance to help you work out how to deal with small arms trafficking. So there are a number of other things in the agreement that the cooperation will empower Barbados, empower CARICOM to be able to deal with matters that sometimes are greater than one individual state can handle on their own. Now, one of the questions that was asked was, well, how come 35 countries have suddenly put a halt or paused on signing the agreement? Our understanding of what has occurred here is that there are persons outside of these countries who have expressed concern about the Samoa Agreement. And they have created an initiative which they are seeking to implement across the world to prevent the signing of the Samoa Agreement. The 106 countries that are involved in this particular agreement all agreed and initialed this agreement some time back. It's only the final signing that would have taken place in the last couple of weeks. And this is where the stirring of concern across the world caused a number of civic bodies and persons, NGOs, to speak to their governments and say, we don't understand what's going on here, we don't know what you're bringing to our country, we don't want you to sign, and so on. And out of respect for their citizens, they paused to have the conversation with their citizens to reassure them that the concerns that were raised really are not in this agreement. And so what has been happening since then is that as they have done that, countries have signed since then, and more will continue to sign, because this agreement gives us a collective of 106 countries to work together to bring changes to the world that will help to make life better for our people. I just want to reassure every Barbadian that when we negotiate on your behalf, we negotiate in good faith, we obey the national laws of Barbados, we do not go outside of those laws, and in addition, if there is anything that we need input on, we go and we approach the stakeholders, which we would have done with this particular agreement. It is just that the concern that there was a hidden agenda behind the gender issue emerged after the fact, and therefore we're quite happy to engage any person on this matter to reassure them. Be assured, this is a good agreement, and what we have to do is to make the best possible use of it, and we invite you to be a part of that journey.